I knew something was wrong the moment I pulled into my driveway in suburban Phoenix, Arizona, and saw that blonde woman in a pantsuit standing in my front yard holding a clipboard like she owned the place. My name is Daniel Yates, and I had just bought this house 3 months ago in a neighborhood called Desert Palms Estates. The house was perfect, a modest 3-bedroom ranch with a decent backyard, and the price was right. What I didn't realize at the time was that the homeowners association was run by a woman named Patricia Morrison, who seemed to believe that her position as HOA president gave her authority over every square inch of property in the neighborhood, including mine. I parked my truck and got out, already feeling the tension building in my shoulders. Patricia was in her late 40s, with that aggressively styled hair that suburban moms seem to favor and a permanent expression that suggested she had just bitten into a lemon. She wore pearls with her pantsuit. Actual pearls, at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday. "Mr. Yates," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass, "we need to discuss your landscaping immediately." I took a deep breath and walked toward her, trying to maintain a friendly demeanor, despite the fact that this was the 4th time in as many weeks that she had shown up unannounced to complain about something. First, it was the color of my front door, which she claimed violated HOA regulations even though it was the same color the previous owners had painted it. Then it was my mailbox, which she said was 2 inches too tall according to some obscure bylaw. Last week, she had cited me for leaving my garbage cans visible from the street on a non-collection day, even though I had only rolled them out an hour before pickup. "Good morning, Patricia," I said, making sure to keep my tone civil. "What seems to be the problem?" She gestured dramatically at the small garden bed I had installed along the driveway. I had spent an entire weekend digging it out, filling it with fresh soil, and planting some native desert plants. I had even put decorative stone markers along the edge to clearly define where my driveway ended and the garden began. The markers were simple but attractive, about 8 inches tall and made of smooth river rock that I had carefully selected at a local landscaping supply store. "These," she said, pointing at the markers with her pen like they were evidence at a crime scene, "are not approved by the architectural committee. All exterior modifications must be submitted for review in writing at least 30 days before installation." I felt my jaw tighten. "Patricia, these are just garden markers. They're not a modification. I'm allowed to have a garden bed." "The markers," she insisted, her voice rising, "create a visual barrier that was not part of the original property design. According to Article 7, Section 3 of the HOA Covenant, any installation that alters the visual landscape requires approval." "That's ridiculous," I said, struggling to keep my composure. "These markers are barely noticeable. They're meant to keep people from driving over my garden." Patricia's eyes narrowed. "The HOA Covenant is not ridiculous, Mr. Yates. It exists to maintain property values and ensure neighborhood standards. I'm giving you 48 hours to remove these markers and submit a proper application if you wish to have them reinstalled." She thrust a piece of paper at me, which turned out to be an official violation notice complete with a $50 fine if I didn't comply within the stated time frame. I took the paper, crumpling it slightly in my grip, and watched as Patricia strutted back to her silver minivan parked across the street. She drove off without another word, leaving me standing in my own yard feeling like I had just been scolded by a particularly authoritarian kindergarten teacher. I went inside and called my neighbor, Marcus, who had lived in Desert Palms Estates for 5 years and had warned me about Patricia when I first moved in. He answered on the 3rd ring, and I could hear the sympathy in his voice when I explained what had just happened. "Yeah, man, that sounds about right. Marcus said with a sigh. Patricia pulled the same thing with me when I put up a new fence. She made me take it down and resubmit the plans 3 times before she approved it, and even then she tried to say the wood stain was the wrong shade. The woman is relentless. What am I supposed to do? I asked, pacing around my kitchen. I can't just let her push me around like this over some garden markers. You could file a dispute with the HOA board, Marcus suggested. But fair warning, Patricia controls the board. She handpicked every member, and they basically rubber stamp whatever she wants. Your other option is to just comply and hope she moves on to harassing someone else. Neither option appealed to me, but I decided to try the diplomatic route first. I spent that evening drafting a formal response to the violation notice, explaining that the markers were a safety feature to protect my property, and that they didn't violate any reasonable interpretation of the HOA covenant. I cited specific sections of the rules that allowed for landscaping improvements, and even included photos showing that several other houses in the neighborhood had similar features. I submitted the response through the HOA's online portal and went to bed feeling cautiously optimistic. 2 days later, I came home from work to find my driveway markers gone. All 12 of them. Just vanished. I stood there staring at the bare edges of my garden bed, feeling a mixture of disbelief and rage building in my chest. Someone had physically removed my property from my yard. I walked along the driveway, checking to see if maybe they had just been knocked over or moved, but there was no sign of them anywhere. They had been deliberately taken. I immediately pulled out my phone and called the non-emergency police line. An officer arrived about 40 minutes later, a young guy named Officer Rodriguez, who looked like he had just graduated from the academy. He took down my statement and photographed the area where the markers had been, but he didn't seem particularly optimistic about finding them. Without witnesses or security footage, there's not much we can do, he explained, his tone apologetic. It's technically theft, but unless you can prove who took them, it'll be hard to pursue. Do you have any security cameras? No, I admitted. I've been meaning to install some, but I haven't gotten around to it yet. Officer Rodriguez nodded and handed me a case number. File a report with your insurance if the markers were valuable, and definitely get those cameras installed. We've been getting more complaints about property theft in this area lately. After he left, I sat on my front steps and stared at my mutilated garden bed. I didn't have proof, but I knew exactly who had taken those markers. Patricia had given me 48 hours to remove them, and when I hadn't complied, she had taken matters into her own hands. The realization made my blood boil, but without evidence, there was nothing I could do. The next morning, I drove to the landscaping supply store and bought new markers. These ones were heavier and larger, about 12 inches tall, and made of decorative concrete that I knew would be much harder to move. I also stopped by an electronics store and purchased a complete security camera system with 4 cameras that covered my entire front yard and driveway. I spent the entire weekend installing everything, running cables, and setting up the monitoring system on my phone. On Monday morning, I left for work feeling more secure. If Patricia or anyone else tried to mess with my property again, I would have video evidence. What I didn't expect was what would happen when I got home that evening. I was about 3 blocks from my house when I got an alert on my phone from the security system. The notification said there was activity detected in my driveway. I pulled up the live feed and felt my heart rate spike. Patricia's silver minivan was parked in my driveway, and Patricia herself was standing next to my garden bed holding a sledgehammer. I gunned the engine and raced home, arriving just in time to see Patricia take a swing at one of my new concrete markers. The sledgehammer connected with a loud crack, and the marker toppled over, a chunk broken off the top. She was in the middle of lining up another swing when I pulled into the driveway, my tires screeching slightly as I stopped. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, jumping out of my truck. Patricia whirled around, the sledgehammer still in her hands. Her face was red, and she had that wild look in her eyes that people get when they're absolutely convinced they are in the right no matter how insane their behavior appears to everyone else. "These markers are in violation of the HOA covenant," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "You were given notice to remove them, and you failed to comply. As HOA president, I have the authority to enforce neighborhood standards by any means necessary. You're destroying my property." I said, pulling out my phone. "That's vandalism. That's a crime." "It's enforcement," Patricia shot back. "You don't seem to understand that when you bought this house, you agreed to abide by HOA rules. Those rules give me the authority to maintain neighborhood aesthetics." I was already dialing 911 as she spoke. Patricia saw what I was doing, and something seemed to click in her brain that maybe she had gone too far. She dropped the sledgehammer and started walking quickly back toward her minivan. "You're not leaving," I said, moving to block her path. "The police are on their way." Patricia's face contorted into an expression of pure fury. "Get out of my way, or I'll have you arrested for harassment and intimidation." "You're on my property with a sledgehammer destroying my stuff," I said, standing my ground. "You're not going anywhere." What happened next occurred so fast that I barely had time to react. Patricia shoved past me with surprising force for someone her size and ran to her minivan. She threw open the door, jumped inside, and started the engine. I stepped back, assuming she was just going to drive away, but instead she threw the vehicle into reverse and backed up at high speed. Her minivan shot backward across my driveway, and I heard her scream something incomprehensible through the closed window. She must have misjudged the distance or been too angry to think clearly, because instead of backing onto the street, she kept going. Her rear tires hit the edge of my garden bed where the markers were supposed to serve as a clear boundary, and then the minivan lurched backward into the drainage ditch that ran along the side of my property. The sound was incredible. Metal crunching, glass shattering, and Patricia screaming. The minivan ended up at a 45-degree angle, its rear end stuck deep in the ditch, and its front tires off the ground, spinning uselessly. Steam or smoke started rising from under the hood, and I could see Patricia inside, frantically trying to open her door, which was jammed against the sloped wall of the ditch. I ran over to the passenger side, which was elevated and accessible. Despite everything she had just done, I wasn't going to leave her trapped in a potentially dangerous vehicle. I yanked open the passenger door and reached in. "Give me your hand," I said. Patricia stared at me with wide eyes, her face now pale and streaked with tears. She seemed to be in shock, but she reached up and grabbed my hand. I pulled her across the center console and helped her climb out of the tilted minivan. We both stumbled away from the vehicle as the steam continued to pour from the engine compartment. Within minutes, my street was filled with emergency vehicles. 2 patrol cars, a fire truck, and an ambulance all arrived in quick succession. Paramedics checked Patricia over while firefighters assessed her minivan to make sure it wasn't going to catch fire. Police officers took statements from both of us, and I showed them the security camera footage on my phone, which had captured the entire incident. The footage was damning. It clearly showed Patricia attacking my property with a sledgehammer, our confrontation, and then her reckless decision to back her minivan into the ditch. The officers watched it twice, taking notes, and then one of them, a sergeant named Morrison, no relation to Patricia, thankfully, pulled me aside. "Mr. Yates, we're going to need to take Miss Morrison to the station for questioning," he said. What she did here amounts to criminal mischief, and possibly reckless endangerment depending on how close she came to hitting you with that vehicle. "We'll need you to come down and file a formal complaint." I nodded, still feeling the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Absolutely. I want to press charges." Patricia overheard me and let out a wail of protest. "This is harassment. I was enforcing HOA regulations. He's the one who violated the covenant." Sergeant Morrison walked over to her, his expression patient but firm. "Madam, HOA regulations don't give you the right to destroy someone's property or drive recklessly on their land. You're going to need to come with us and answer some questions." They placed Patricia in the back of a patrol car, and I watched as they drove away. The fire department declared her minivan safe for the moment, though it would need to be towed out of the ditch. A wrecker service arrived about an hour later and spent considerable time and effort extracting the vehicle, which sustained significant damage to its rear bumper, exhaust system, and undercarriage. I spent the next few hours at the police station giving a detailed statement and providing copies of the security footage. The officers were professional and thorough, and I got the sense that they had dealt with HOA disputes before, though perhaps not ones that escalated quite this dramatically. They told me that Patricia had been cited for criminal mischief and reckless driving, and that the district attorney would review the case to determine if additional charges were warranted. When I finally got home that night, it was after 10. My driveway was dark, except for the flashing lights of a police vehicle still parked across the street, apparently there to ensure no one interfered with the scene. I sat in my truck for a long moment, just staring at the damaged marker, the gouges in my driveway from the minivan's tires, and the torn-up section of the ditch where the vehicle had crashed through. Part of me couldn't believe this had actually happened. I had moved to Desert Palms Estates expecting a quiet suburban life, not a war with a deranged HOA president. But another part of me felt a grim satisfaction knowing that Patricia had finally gone too far and would face real consequences for her behavior. The next morning, my phone started ringing before 7. The first call was from Marcus, who had heard about the incident through the neighborhood grapevine. Word traveled fast in Desert Palms Estates, apparently. He sounded both shocked and unsurprised, if that was possible. "Dude, I heard Patricia drove into your ditch," Marcus said, his voice incredulous. "Is that actually true?" "Completely true," I confirmed, and then I spent the next 20 minutes filling him in on all the details. Marcus listened with increasing amazement, occasionally interrupting with exclamations of disbelief. I knew she was controlling, but I never thought she would actually destroy someone's property and then crash her own car, Marcus said. "This is next-level crazy." The second call came from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a woman's voice introduced herself as Jennifer Chen, a reporter from the local Phoenix news station. Someone, probably a neighbor or maybe even someone who had scanned the police radio, had tipped her off about the incident, and she wanted to interview me. "I'd like to do a story about what happened," Jennifer explained. HOA overreach is a topic that resonates with a lot of people, and this situation seems particularly egregious. "Would you be willing to talk on camera?" I hesitated for a moment, wondering if going public was a good idea. But then I thought about all the times Patricia had bullied me and probably countless other homeowners in the neighborhood. Maybe some public scrutiny was exactly what the Desert Palms Estates HOA needed. "Yeah," I said, "I'll do it." Jennifer and a cameraman showed up at my house that afternoon. I gave them a tour of the damaged property, showed them the broken marker and the torn-up ditch, and explained the history of my conflict with Patricia. Jennifer was professional and sympathetic, asking good questions and letting me tell the story in my own words. They also interviewed Marcus and another neighbor named Helen, who had her own horror stories about Patricia's enforcement tactics. The story aired on the evening news 2 days later. I watched it with a mixture of pride and nervousness as the reporter laid out the situation, complete with footage of my property and interviews with neighborhood residents. The piece painted a damning picture of an HOA president who had abused her authority to the point of criminal behavior. They even got a comment from a legal expert who explained that HOA covenants don't override property rights or give anyone permission to destroy personal property. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. My phone blew up with calls and texts from people I hadn't heard from in years, all expressing support. The news station's website crashed briefly from the traffic to the story, and the comments section was filled with people sharing their own HOA nightmare stories. Several local lawyers reached out offering to represent me pro bono if I wanted to pursue civil action against Patricia and the HOA. But the most significant reaction came from within Desert Palms Estates itself. Within 48 hours of the news story airing, a petition began circulating among homeowners calling for Patricia's immediate removal as HOA president. The petition cited the criminal charges against her, the news coverage, and a long list of complaints from residents about her aggressive enforcement tactics. Within a week, the petition had signatures from over 70% of the homeowners in the neighborhood. I attended the emergency HOA board meeting that was called to address the situation. The meeting was held in the community center, a bland rectangular building with fluorescent lights and industrial carpeting that smelled faintly of mildew. The room was packed with residents, many of whom I had never met before. The energy in the room was tense and angry, with people muttering to each other and shooting dark looks at the board members seated at a table at the front. Patricia was not present. According to the board secretary, a timid woman named Linda who looked like she wanted to be anywhere else, Patricia had resigned her position as HOA president effective immediately. The resignation had come through in an email earlier that day, offering no explanation or apology, just a curt statement that she was stepping down. The vice president, a man named Robert who had clearly never expected to actually have to run a meeting, fumbled through an agenda that mostly consisted of angry residents standing up to complain about years of Patricia's tyrannical behavior. Person after person took the microphone to share stories of ridiculous fines, arbitrary rule enforcement, and intimidation tactics. One elderly man named Frank described how Patricia had threatened to foreclose on his house over a lawn ornament that she deemed inappropriate, even though the ornament was a simple ceramic frog that his late wife had bought. A young couple talked about how Patricia had tried to force them to remove their vegetable garden because she said it was unsightly, even though it was in their backyard and barely visible from the street. The meeting lasted over 3 hours, and by the end, the board had voted to suspend all pending violation notices pending a comprehensive review of HOA enforcement policies. They also voted to hire an independent management company to handle HOA operations going forward, effectively stripping the remaining board members of most of their power. I left the meeting feeling vindicated but exhausted. The past 2 weeks had been an emotional roller coaster, and I was ready for things to return to normal. But I knew the legal process was far from over. Patricia's criminal case moved forward slowly, as these things tend to do. The district attorney's office charged her with criminal mischief in the 3rd degree and reckless driving. Her lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal that would have resulted in probation and community service, but I pushed back through the victim advocate assigned to my case. I wanted Patricia to face real consequences, not just a slap on the wrist. The case went to trial 6 months later. I sat in the courtroom and watched as the prosecutor methodically laid out the evidence against Patricia. They played the security camera footage, which showed Patricia's attack on my property in crystal clear detail. They called me to testify, and I described the months of harassment and escalating confrontations that had led up to that day. They even called a forensic expert who had analyzed the damage to Patricia's minivan and testified that based on the vehicle's trajectory and speed, she had been driving recklessly and without regard for safety. Patricia's defense lawyer tried to argue that she had been acting within her authority as HOA president, and that the situation had been a tragic accident caused by my aggressive behavior. But the jury didn't buy it. After less than 4 hours of deliberation, they returned a guilty verdict on both counts. The judge sentenced Patricia to 90 days in jail, though he suspended 60 days pending successful completion of probation. She was also ordered to pay restitution for the damage to my property, attend anger management counseling, and perform 200 hours of community service. Patricia stood at the defense table as the sentence was read, her face pale and expressionless. Nothing like the confident, aggressive woman who had showed up in my yard with a sledgehammer months earlier. After the criminal case concluded, I filed a civil lawsuit against Patricia personally and against the Desert Palms Estates, HOA. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Rachel who specialized in property disputes, argued that the HOA was liable for Patricia's actions because she had been acting in her capacity as president when she destroyed my property. She also argued that the HOA had created a culture that enabled Patricia's abusive behavior by failing to provide oversight or accountability. The HOA's insurance company ended up settling out of court for a substantial sum that covered all my damages, legal fees, and included compensation for emotional distress. The settlement also required the HOA to implement new governance policies, including term limits for board members, a formal appeals process for violation notices, and mandatory training on property rights for anyone serving in a leadership position. Patricia's personal finances took a hit as well. She ended up filing for bankruptcy after the restitution order, and legal fees piled up. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she and her husband had put their house in Desert Palms Estates up for sale and were planning to move out of state. I felt a small pang of something that might have been sympathy, but mostly I just felt relief that she would no longer be part of my daily life. In the aftermath of everything, Desert Palms Estates transformed into a much more pleasant place to live. The new management company that the HOA board had hired turned out to be professional and reasonable. They enforced rules that actually made sense, like requiring people to maintain their lawns and not leave junk cars in driveways, but they didn't harass residents over trivial matters. The board elections that took place a year after Patricia's resignation brought in a slate of new members who seemed genuinely interested in serving the community rather than wielding power. I became something of a minor celebrity in the neighborhood, known as the guy who had stood up to the tyrannical HOA president and won. People would stop me at the community pool or the grocery store to thank me for what I had done. Some of them shared their own stories of Patricia's harassment, expressing relief that she was finally gone. A few even told me that they had been planning to sell their homes and leave the neighborhood specifically because of Patricia's behavior, but now felt like they could stay. Marcus and I became close friends through the whole ordeal. We started a tradition of having beers on my back patio every Friday evening, talking about work and sports and life in general. He joked that my property had become hallowed ground in the neighborhood, a symbol of resistance against HOA tyranny. I laughed, but had to admit there was something satisfying about knowing that my stand had made a real difference. I also finally finished my landscaping project. With the settlement money, I was able to hire a professional landscape designer who created a beautiful desert garden along my driveway. We installed new markers, even more substantial than the concrete ones Patricia had destroyed, made of natural stone that complemented the desert aesthetic. I added drought-resistant plants like agave, prickly pear cactus, and desert marigolds that thrived in the Phoenix heat. The garden became a real point of pride, and neighbors would often compliment me on it when they walked by. The drainage ditch where Patricia's minivan had crashed got repaired by the city after I filed a complaint about the damage. They reinforced the slope with new landscaping cloth and gravel, and honestly, it looked better than it had before the incident. Every time I looked at that ditch, though, I thought about that wild moment when Patricia had backed her minivan at high speed, her face twisted with rage, and ended up stuck at a 45-degree angle with her tires spinning uselessly in the air. I kept the security camera system installed, and even upgraded it after a year with higher resolution cameras and better night vision. Those cameras had saved me from what could have been a he said, she said situation with Patricia, and I wasn't taking any chances. The footage from that day had been played so many times during the trial and in news coverage that it had taken on an almost mythical quality. Someone had even made it into a meme that circulated on social media for a while, with captions about HOA Karens getting what they deserved. About 18 months after the incident, I was working in my garage on a Saturday morning when a car I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway. I tensed up instinctively, old habits from the Patricia era dying hard, but relaxed when I saw it was just a young couple with a baby carrier. They got out and approached with friendly smiles. "Hi, are you Daniel Yates?" the woman asked. She was probably in her late 20s with curly red hair and glasses. "That's me," I said, wiping grease off my hands with a rag. "Can I help you?" "We're Sarah and Tom," she said, gesturing to her husband. "We're thinking about buying a house in this neighborhood, and our realtor told us about what happened with the HOA president. We wanted to talk to you about what it's like living here now." I invited them to sit on my front porch, and we talked for about half an hour. I told them honestly about my experience with Patricia, but I also explained how much things had changed since then. I described the new management company, the reformed board, and the much more reasonable approach to enforcement. Sarah and Tom listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions, and by the end of the conversation they seemed reassured. "It sounds like this neighborhood learned a hard lesson," Tom said. "But it also sounds like the community came together and fixed the problem, which is actually pretty impressive." They ended up buying a house 3 streets over, and I would see them occasionally at neighborhood events. Sarah joined the HOA board a year later, bringing a level-headed perspective and genuine commitment to serving homeowners rather than controlling them. It felt like a full-circle moment, seeing new residents who had been initially scared off by the story of Patricia instead becoming part of the solution. My own involvement with the HOA remained minimal by choice. I attended annual meetings and voted on important issues, but I had no desire to join the board or take on any leadership role. I had spent enough time dealing with HOA drama to last a lifetime. Instead, I focused on my house, my job, and building genuine friendships with my neighbors based on mutual respect, rather than enforced compliance with arbitrary rules. The broken marker that Patricia had smashed with the sledgehammer, I kept in my garage as a souvenir. It sat on a shelf next to my tools, a chunk of concrete with a jagged crack running through it. Friends who knew the story would sometimes point at it and laugh, asking why I kept it. I usually told them it was a reminder that standing up for yourself matters, even when the person trying to push you around seems to have all the power. There were moments when I thought about Patricia and wondered what her life was like now. Had she learned anything from the experience? Did she regret her actions, or did she still believe she had been in the right? I would never know, and ultimately it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was gone, the neighborhood was better for it, and I could live in my own house without constantly looking over my shoulder for the next violation notice. The local news station did a follow-up story a year after the original incident, checking in on what had changed in Desert Palms Estates. Jennifer Chen, the same reporter who had covered the initial story, came back to interview me and several other residents. The follow-up piece was much more positive, focusing on the reforms that had been implemented and how the community had rebuilt trust between homeowners and the HOA. It was gratifying to see that the story had a happy ending, or at least as happy as these things can get. One unexpected consequence of all the publicity was that I started getting contacted by homeowners from other neighborhoods dealing with their own HOA issues. People would email me or send messages through social media asking for advice on how to fight back against unreasonable HOAs. I wasn't a lawyer or an expert, but I tried to help where I could, usually by recommending that they document everything, know their rights, and not be afraid to seek legal counsel if necessary. A few people told me that my story had inspired them to stand up to their own HOA bullies, which felt good. The civil settlement money I received allowed me to make several improvements to my house that I had been putting off. I renovated the kitchen, upgraded the HVAC system, and built a custom patio in the backyard with a built-in grill and fire pit. The patio became a gathering spot for friends and neighbors, and I hosted regular barbecues throughout the year. It was ironic that Patricia's destructive behavior had ultimately led to me being able to afford improvements that made my house even nicer and increased its value, the exact opposite of what she had claimed would happen if I didn't follow her rules. Marcus liked to joke that I should send Patricia a thank you card for inadvertently financing my home improvements, but I never did. There was no point in antagonizing her further, and besides, I preferred to just move on with my life. The whole experience had taught me valuable lessons about standing up for yourself, the importance of documentation, and the power of community when people come together against injustice. My garden markers, the ones that had sparked the entire conflict, remained in place and continued to serve their purpose. They clearly defined the edge of my driveway, protecting my garden bed from errant vehicles. No one had hit them or damaged them since Patricia's rampage, and the garden itself flourished, adding color and life to my property. Every time I pulled into my driveway and saw those markers, I felt a small sense of triumph. The ditch that had swallowed Patricia's minivan became something of a neighborhood landmark. Kids would ride their bikes past and point at it, telling exaggerated versions of the story to their friends. "That's where the crazy HOA lady crashed her car," I overheard one teenager saying to another. The story had taken on a life of its own, growing in the telling, and I occasionally had to correct particularly wild versions that made it sound like Patricia had intentionally tried to run me over or that her minivan had exploded in flames. The truth was dramatic enough without embellishment. About 2 years after the incident, I was working from home one afternoon when my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and when I checked the security camera feed on my phone, I saw an unfamiliar man standing on my porch. He was probably in his 50s, wearing business casual clothes and holding what looked like a bottle of wine. Curious but cautious, I went to the door. "Can I help you?" I asked through the screen door. "Mr. Yates." "My name is David Morrison," the man said. "I'm Patricia's husband. I was hoping I could talk to you for a few minutes." My first instinct was to tell him to leave, but something in his demeanor made me pause. He looked tired and defeated, nothing like the aggressive stance I had always seen Patricia adopt. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. "What do you want?" I asked, not bothering to hide my wariness. David held out the bottle of wine. "I wanted to apologize for what Patricia did. I know it doesn't change anything, and I'm not here to make excuses for her, but I needed you to know that not everyone in my family thought what she did was okay." I took the wine, more out of surprise than anything else. "Did she send you here?" "God, no," David said with a bitter laugh. "She doesn't even know I came. We're divorced now, actually. The whole incident, the trial, everything that followed, it just destroyed our marriage. I spent 23 years with a woman I thought I knew, and it turned out she was capable of things I never imagined." We ended up talking on my porch for over an hour. David told me about Patricia's growing obsession with the HOA over the years, how it had started as a genuine desire to maintain the neighborhood, but had gradually twisted into something darker. He described watching her become increasingly controlling and paranoid, convinced that homeowners were deliberately defying her, and that only her constant vigilance kept the neighborhood from descending into chaos. "I tried to talk to her about it," David said, staring at his hands. "Especially after she started spending every evening driving around the neighborhood looking for violations. But she wouldn't listen. She was convinced she was doing the right thing, protecting property values and maintaining standards. And then, when you moved in and actually pushed back, something in her just snapped." I listened with a mixture of anger and sympathy. Patricia had made my life hell for months, but hearing David's perspective humanized her in a way I hadn't expected. She wasn't just a cartoon villain. She was a person who had become consumed by a toxic sense of duty and lost sight of reasonable behavior. "I'm not asking you to forgive her," David continued. "What she did was wrong, criminally wrong, and she paid the price for it. I just wanted you to know that there were consequences beyond what you saw in court. Our marriage fell apart. She lost most of her friends. She had to move to Oregon to live with her sister because she couldn't find work here after everything became public. Her entire life imploded." After David left, I sat on my porch with the unopened bottle of wine and thought about everything he had said. I didn't forgive Patricia for what she had done, but I felt a sense of closure knowing that the full consequences of her actions had caught up with her. Justice had been served, not just in the legal sense, but in the broader arc of cause and effect. Life in Desert Palms Estates continued to improve as more time passed. The HOA became something it was supposed to be, an administrative body that handled common area maintenance and enforced reasonable rules that actually benefited residents. There were no more surprise visits from board members with clipboards. No more threatening violation notices over trivial matters. No more atmosphere of fear and intimidation. I even ended up joining the architectural committee, the same committee that Patricia had used as a weapon against homeowners. Under new leadership, the committee's purpose shifted to actually helping residents with their projects rather than finding reasons to deny them. We streamlined the approval process, created clear guidelines that were easy to understand, and made ourselves available to answer questions. It felt good to be part of the solution. The scars from Patricia's reign gradually faded, both literal and metaphorical. The gouge marks in my driveway from her minivan's spinning tires eventually wore smooth from weather and use. The marker she had smashed was replaced with a matching stone that blended seamlessly with the others. The ditch was fully repaired. Physically, it was like the incident had never happened, but the memory remained, and more importantly, the lessons learned. Homeowners in Desert Palms estates became more engaged with HOA governance, attending meetings and holding board members accountable. The days of rubber stamping decisions made by an authoritarian president were over. People had learned that their voices mattered, and that standing together against unreasonable authority was not only possible but necessary. I sometimes thought about what would have happened if I had just removed those original markers when Patricia first demanded it. Would she have moved on to someone else, or would she have found some other excuse to target me? Would she have eventually escalated anyway, or was it my resistance that pushed her over the edge? These were unanswerable questions, but I didn't regret my decision to stand my ground. Bullies only stop when someone refuses to be bullied. My house became a real home in the years following the incident. I dated someone for a while, a woman named Andrea who thought the whole HOA saga was both horrifying and hilarious. She moved in for a few months, and though that relationship eventually ended amicably, it was nice to share the space with someone who appreciated the journey I had been through. The house held good memories now, not just the stress and conflict of those early months. Marcus and I maintained our Friday evening beer tradition, though we branched out to include other neighbors as well. Helen joined us sometimes, along with Sarah and Tom, the couple who had asked about the neighborhood before buying their house. We would sit on my patio as the sun set over the desert, talking about everything and nothing, enjoying the simple pleasure of community without coercion. The security camera footage of Patricia attacking my markers and then crashing into the ditch occasionally resurfaced on social media, usually when someone posted it to a forum or group dedicated to HOA horror stories. Each time it made the rounds, I would get a new wave of messages from people expressing support or sharing their own experiences. The incident had become a cautionary tale about what happens when HOA power goes unchecked. I never forgot the feeling of standing in my driveway that evening, watching Patricia struggle to get out of her tilted minivan, knowing that she had finally gone too far and would face consequences. It was a mixture of vindication, shock, and concern for her safety despite everything she had put me through. That moment crystallized something important for me about maintaining your humanity even when dealing with people who seem to have lost theirs. The broken marker stayed on my garage shelf, gathering dust but serving its purpose as a reminder. Friends who visited and knew the story would sometimes ask to see it, treating it like a museum artifact from a battle well fought. I always obliged, pulling it down and letting them hold the physical evidence of Patricia's destructive rage. The weight of the concrete, the jagged crack from the sledgehammer impact, it told a story more effectively than words could. Desert Palms Estates became known in the wider Phoenix area as the neighborhood that had reformed its HOA after a major scandal. Real estate agents used it as a selling point, explaining to prospective buyers that the community had been through a trial by fire and emerged stronger. Property values actually increased in the years following Patricia's removal, disproving her constant warnings that any deviation from her rules would destroy home values. I built a life I was proud of in that house on that street in that neighborhood. The conflict with Patricia, as traumatic as it had been at the time, became just one chapter in a much larger story. I had a career I enjoyed, friends who valued me, and a home that truly felt like mine. The garden markers stayed in place, no longer symbols of conflict but simply practical features that served their intended purpose. Years later, when I would tell the story to new acquaintances, they always had the same reaction, a mixture of disbelief and fascination. "She actually took a sledgehammer to your property?" they would ask, "and then drove her minivan into a ditch?" And I would nod, confirming that yes, it really happened, and yes, it was as absurd as it sounded. But I would also explain how the community came together, how reforms were implemented, and how one person's destructive behavior ultimately led to positive change. The story of Patricia Morrison, the HOA president who stole my driveway markers and then drove her minivan straight into my ditch, became part of the neighborhood lore. Parents used it to teach their kids about standing up to bullies. New board members studied it as a case study in what not to do. Real estate agents mentioned it to demonstrate the community's commitment to good governance. And me? I just lived my life, tended my garden, maintained my property, and enjoyed the peace that came from knowing I had stood up for myself when it mattered. The markers along my driveway remained in place, sturdy and unmoved, a permanent testament to the fact that sometimes the smallest stands against injustice can lead to the biggest changes. Every time I pulled into my driveway and saw those markers and the repaired ditch beyond them, I smiled, remembering the day when everything changed, and a neighborhood learned that no one, not even the HOA president, is above the law.